What happens when the country next door decides your entire auto industry isn't worth protecting anymore? On January 1st, 2027, one number could decide whether hundreds of thousands of jobs survive on both sides of a single border. If you care about how smaller countries fight back against giants without blowing everything up, hit that like button right now, type precision in the comments, and subscribe before we go any further, because this story is still moving and the next few weeks are going to matter a lot. Here's what actually happened this week with no phone call, no press conference, and no warning to his own trade officials. Donald Trump sat down and typed a message on Truth Social. In it, he announced that starting January 1st, 2027, tariffs on Canadian cars, trucks, auto parts, and steel would jump to 50%. Every vehicle, every part, every ton of steel cut in half by a tax before it even reaches an American dealership or an American factory floor. That is not a small policy adjustment. That is a direct hit aimed at one of the most tightly woven manufacturing relationships anywhere on Earth. Cars don't just get built in one country anymore and shipped somewhere else to be sold. A single vehicle can cross the Canada-US border 3, 4, sometimes 5 separate times before it's ever finished. Steel gets stamped into shape in one country, shipped across for engine or transmission work in another, sent back for final assembly, and then crosses one more time as a completed vehicle heading to a dealership lot. That entire system exists because it works, and it only works if the tax on crossing that border stays low, or exempted altogether. Drop a 50% tariff into the middle of a system built like that, and it doesn't behave like a simple tax on a finished import. It compounds every single time a half-built product crosses the line again. A tariff that sounds like one number on paper can quietly turn into something closer to 2 or 3 times that in real cost, depending on how many times a part travels back and forth before it ever becomes a finished car. And so how did we actually get here? Let's rewind about a week, because the sequence matters more than people realize. For weeks before this blew up, American and Canadian negotiators had been quietly working toward a new trade framework, one that would have meaningfully lowered tariffs that were already causing real pain on both sides of the border. The deal on the table would have cut the top-line tariff on Canadian cars and light trucks, and cut steel and aluminum tariffs roughly in half. Canada's chief trade negotiator, Dominic LeBlanc, walked out of a session with his American counterpart on a Thursday and told reporters things were going well. He said they were very close, and that they'd keep working until they got there. 2 days later, it was over. Talks collapsed late on a Friday night. Both governments blamed each other for introducing last-minute demands neither side could accept. And at the stroke of midnight, the United States imposed a 50% tariff on roughly $20 billion worth of Canadian exports. Hockey sticks, cement, wine, liquor, certain categories of clothing, Washington. Framed it as retaliation for what it called Canadian trade discrimination against American cars, alcohol, and dairy products. The next morning, Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, didn't try to hide his frustration. He called the entire episode a miscalculation and said the breakdown came down to demands from the Trump administration that he considered uneconomic and unfair. But the sentence that mattered most for everything that came after wasn't about blame. It was about strategy. Carney said Canada would match the American tariffs dollar for dollar. Not double them, not escalate past them, match them exactly, dollar for dollar. Hold on to that phrase, because it is the entire foundation this whole story is built on. And here's the part almost nobody outside trade circles picked up on right away. This wasn't the first time Carney's government had said almost that exact same thing. Then, only 2 days after that statement, Trump escalated again, and this time he went straight for the industry that matters most to both economies at once. That's when the 50% tariff on Canadian cars, trucks, parts, and steel appeared. Time to begin January 1st, 2027. In the same post, Trump wrote that Canada had been taking advantage of the United States for years, called Canadian officials some of the hardest in the world to deal with, and said Canada would no longer be treated like a favorite partner. He added, in capital letters, that Canada felt entitled, even though the United States doesn't actually need Canada the way Canada needs the United States. Later that same day, his language got sharper still, referring to Canadian officials in dismissive terms, and warning that consequences would get far worse if they didn't fall in line. It's worth sitting with how quickly that escalation arrived. Trump's Monday post landed directly on the heels of Carney's Saturday statement promising to match tariffs dollar for dollar, which means the 50% auto and steel threat reads, at least in part, as a direct response to Canada's own response. An escalation triggered by the exact kind of matching retaliation this whole story is actually about. That sequencing changes how you should understand this fight. This isn't simply Washington making one unilateral move and Canada reacting once. This is now at least 3 moves deep. The collapsed negotiation, The first round of 50% tariffs on $20 billion of Canadian goods. Canada's pledged to match those tariffs precisely. And then Trump's much larger threat aims squarely at the auto sector, which looks very much like a reaction to that pledge. Whether this pattern keeps repeating depends heavily on what happens on September 8th, when Canada's matching tariffs officially take effect. The White House gets its first real look at how Ottawa intends to follow through in practice, not just in words. There's a technical detail buried inside that announcement that actually matters enormously, and most of the coverage around it glossed right over it. Canada's current auto tariff situation isn't a flat 25% applied to everything crossing the border. That 25% rate applies specifically to non-U.S. content inside a vehicle. Under the existing USMCA framework, vehicles and parts that comply with that agreement have largely been exempt from these additional tariffs altogether. When Trump posted his 50% threat, he did not clarify whether USMCA-compliant automobiles and parts would keep that exemption going forward. Steel from Canada is already sitting at a 50% tariff rate right now. Nobody in Washington clarified, as of this week, whether the new threat meant that number simply stays at 50, or whether it stacks on top of what's already in place, meaning some categories could functionally approach 100%. That is not a small ambiguity to leave hanging. In an industry where a single vehicle crosses the U.S. Canada-Mexico border multiple times during one assembly process, engines going one direction, transmissions going another, finished vehicles crossing a third time, that kind of uncertainty is almost as damaging as the tariff itself, because manufacturers cannot plan production around a number that nobody has actually defined in writing. For context on exactly how much is riding on this relationship, Canada is currently the third highest source of U.S. imports anywhere in the world. In 2025 alone, more than $380 billion worth of goods crossed that border, according to official trade data. This is not a minor trading partner sitting on the edges of the American economy. This is one of the largest, most physically integrated trade relationships that exists between any two countries on the planet, and it is the one currently absorbing the sharpest escalation of trade policy this entire administration has produced. Before we go further into Canada's actual response, if you're the kind of person who wants to understand what's really happening underneath the headlines instead of just reacting to the loudest quote of the week, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It genuinely helps this reach more people trying to understand this fight instead of just react to it, and there are 2 dates coming up in the next few months that are going to decide how this whole thing plays out. So let's actually get into the move Canada made, because this is where the story becomes genuinely interesting. It isn't a single announcement, it's a pattern, and Carney's government has now run this exact play twice, in almost the exact same way, in under 2 years. Go back to March of this year. Trump had just imposed a 25% tariff on imported automobiles and parts. Carney, newly installed as Prime Minister at the time, convened Canada's Cabinet Committee on Canada-U.S. Relations and came out with a direct, specific response almost immediately. He didn't threaten to shut down cross-border trade entirely. He didn't reach for the biggest possible retaliation available to him. He matched it, announcing a 25% tariff specifically on U.S. auto imports that did not comply with the USMCA agreement. And critically, he built in 2 very deliberate carve-outs. The Canadian tariffs would not touch auto parts, because, as Carney put it directly at the time, Canada understood the benefits of an integrated production system that both countries depend on, and they would not apply to vehicle content coming from Mexico, because Mexico was respecting the terms of the agreement while the dispute was strictly between Washington and Ottawa. As Carney told President Trump directly during a call the week before, Canada would respond to the U.S. auto tariffs, and he announced that Canada's government would be responding by matching the American approach precisely. He said the move would generate roughly $8 billion, and he committed every single dollar of it directly to Canadian auto workers, and the companies absorbing the impact of the American tariffs. That was the first version of the playbook, match precisely. Protect the parts of the relationship that are actually working. Send the resulting money straight to the people getting hurt, not into a general government account somewhere. Now fast forward to this week, and you can see the exact same logic showing up again, just at a much larger scale, because the provocation itself is much larger this time. After the Friday night collapse and the new 50% U.S. tariffs on that $20 billion of Canadian goods, Carney didn't reach for an across-the-board retaliation either. He confirmed that Canada's counter tariffs will take effect on September 8th, and that they will match the American measures dollar for dollar, aimed specifically at the categories where the U.S. tariffs are landing on Canada. And this week, Canada's government held a press conference in Ottawa to go a full step further, unveiling a package specifically designed, in the government's own words, to protect and support Canadian workers and businesses hit by those new 50% U.S. tariffs. Canada's finance minister, industry minister, jobs minister, and even the minister responsible for artificial intelligence all appeared together to lay out the specifics, which reporting indicates includes loans and direct financial benefits aimed at the businesses and workers most exposed to the American tariffs. 4 different ministers standing side by side for one announcement is not a small gesture. It's a signal that this isn't being treated as a minor trade dispute anymore inside Ottawa. It's being treated as a genuine economic emergency, requiring coordination across multiple parts of government at once. There's also a political dimension worth understanding here, because it explains why Carney's government keeps reaching for this specific playbook instead of something louder and more satisfying in the moment. A Canadian government that responds to an American tariff threat with an even bigger tariff threat of its own risks being framed, both domestically and internationally, as the side that escalated a manageable dispute into an unmanageable one. A government that matches precisely, protects the parts of the relationship both economies actually depend on, and redirects the resulting revenue straight to its own affected workers gets to make a very different argument, that it is being measured and responsible in the face of an unpredictable trading partner, rather than reckless or reactionary. That framing matters both for how the story gets covered internationally and for how it plays domestically with Canadian industries and workers who are watching closely to see whether their own government is actually protecting them or simply posturing for the cameras while they absorb the real cost. Look at what that actually is strategically, because it's worth naming clearly. It is not a mirror image of Trump's approach. Trump's language has been maximalist from the start. Canada doesn't matter the way it thinks it does. Canada will be treated like a state no longer, threatening entire categories at once without ever clarifying which exemptions survive the threat. Canada's response, both this week and back in March, has been the opposite instinct entirely. Match the number precisely, target it narrowly, protect the parts of the integrated supply chain that both economies actually depend on, like auto parts and USMCA compliant vehicles, and then take the retaliatory revenue and put it directly into the hands of the workers and companies absorbing the hit, rather than letting it disappear into a general treasury somewhere with no clear destination. That combination, precision paired with direct compensation, is the actual move here. And it's exactly why trade analysts have been describing Canada's posture in this fight as calculated rather than reactive. Now here's a question worth sitting with for a second, because it's not as obvious as it first sounds. If matching a tariff dollar for dollar sounds this simple, why does it actually take real skill to execute well? Because on paper, it looks easy. Hit the same number back, match what they hit you with. But in practice, this approach requires a government to make dozens of extremely granular decisions about exactly which products to target. And getting even one of those decisions wrong can do just as much damage domestically as doing nothing at all. When Ottawa built its March response, the decision to exclude auto parts entirely wasn't a symbolic gesture thrown in to look generous. It was a recognition that a huge share of what actually crosses that border in the auto sector isn't finished vehicles at all. It's components, engines, transmissions, sensors, wiring harnesses, and taxing those components to match Washington dollar for dollar would have meant Canada taxing its own manufacturers indirectly, since so many Canadian-made parts get shipped south, assembled into American-built vehicles, and in some cases shipped back north, again before final sale to a customer. Hitting that category just to match the headline number would have punished the exact same Canadian workers the tariff response was supposed to be protecting in the first place. That kind of granular, careful targeting is what actually separates a strategic countermeasure from a blunt, retaliatory tariff slapped on with nothing more than a calculator. The same logic shows up again in this week's response. The categories hit by the new 50% U.S. tariffs, hockey sticks, cement, wine, liquor, certain kinds of clothing, are specific, enough that Canada's matching measures can be built around that exact same list, rather than a much broader basket of unrelated goods. That precision is deliberate, and it's also a signal aimed at Washington as much as it's a policy choice on its own. It tells the White House, in effect, we are responding exactly to what you did, not using this moment as an excuse to punish a wider range of American products that had nothing to do with this specific fight. Whether that message actually lands the way Ottawa intends is a separate and much harder question. Trump's own rhetoric this week doesn't necessarily suggest it's softened the tone coming out of Washington at all. But it does mean that if and when this dispute eventually makes its way back to a negotiating table, the list of grievances on both sides stays relatively contained instead of having sprawled outward into a dozen unrelated sectors that would each need their own separate resolution before anything can move forward again. It's also worth understanding why this restraint matters more than it might seem to on the surface. A broad, unfocused retaliation, taxing everything the U.S. sells into Canada across the board, would hurt Canadian consumers and businesses just as much as it hurts American exporters, because Canada imports a huge amount from the U.S. across categories that have absolutely nothing to do with this specific fight. By narrowing the response to dollar-for-dollar matching in the exact categories where the U.S. escalated, Carney's government avoids turning this into an uncontrolled trade war across the entire relationship. It keeps the conflict contained to the specific fight Trump picked, rather than letting it metastasize into something that damages sectors that were never part of the original dispute at all, that is functionally a form of de-escalation dressed up as retaliation. You match the aggression precisely enough that you're clearly not the one who caused this to spiral further, while still making it unmistakably clear that you're not going to simply absorb the cost either. There's a financial dimension worth spelling out clearly, too, because a phrase like protect and support can sound like vague government language until you actually see what it's designed to do underneath the surface. Back in March, Carney committed the entire, roughly $8 billion generated by Canada's counter tariffs directly to auto workers and the companies absorbing the American tariffs, not to general government spending, not to some unrelated priority, directly to the specific people getting hurt by this fight. That detail is the difference between a retaliatory tariff that's purely symbolic and one that's functionally acting as a redistribution mechanism. Washington's tariff costs get partially offset by revenue Canada collects on its own matching measures, and that revenue gets funneled straight back to the workers and businesses on the Canadian side of the equation who are actually absorbing the damage day to day. This week's announcement, with 4 different ministers standing together, strongly suggests the same architecture is being built again. Loans and direct benefits aimed specifically at the businesses and workers exposed to the new 50% tariffs on that $20 billion in Canadian exports. If you've made it this far into the video, you already understand more about this fight than most people watching the headlines scroll by on their phones. So do me a favor, drop a single word in the comments, either match or escalate, telling me which strategy you'd choose if you were the one running a smaller economy standing up to a much bigger one. I read through these, and it genuinely helps more people find this video instead of the surface level takes flooding everywhere else right now. So, is this strategy actually working? That's the honest question here, and it deserves an honest answer rather than a triumphant one dressed up as good news. Trump has not walked back the January 2027 threat. As of this week, it's still sitting on the table, still unclarified on the USMCA exemption question, and still scheduled to take effect in a little over 4 months from now. Trade attorneys are watching this with real caution rather than confidence that it resolves cleanly on its own. And it's worth remembering that industry voices on the American side aren't exactly cheering this outcome either, even though it's technically their government imposing the tariff. Speaking about the broader threat on parts specifically, the President of Canada's Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association put the stakes in the starkest terms anyone in this fight has used so far. A threatened U.S. tariff on Canadian auto parts will ultimately be paid by American auto assembly plants, he said. Without those specific parts, auto assembly throughout the entire United States would grind to a halt. That's not a Canadian official talking up leverage to sound tough in an interview. That's the head of the organization representing the companies that actually manufacture the parts American factories depend on every single day, warning that this tariff, if it lands the way it's currently written, doesn't just cost Canada. It threatens production happening on American soil, too. There's also real skepticism from inside the industry about whether the January 2027 number will ever actually take effect exactly as announced. Auto executives, speaking on condition of anonymity, have pointed out that Trump has previously announced large tariffs that were later scaled back, delayed, or simply never implemented at all once the deadline actually approached. They've noted that January 2027 falls right after the upcoming November midterm elections, raising the real possibility that this threat is aimed more at forcing Canada back to the table on better terms for Washington than at ever becoming permanent, lasting policy. There's actual precedent for that reading, and it's worth knowing. Earlier this year, Trump threatened to decertify a major Canadian-made business jet and slap 50% tariffs on Canadian-made aircraft over a certification dispute involving a rival American manufacturer. Neither threatened action ultimately happened. The following month, Canada certified the aircraft in question, and the threat quietly disappeared without much fanfare at all. That is the exact pattern industry insiders are watching closely for again here. A maximalist number thrown out publicly for leverage, followed eventually by a resolution that looks nothing like the original headline once both sides are actually back at the table negotiating in private. And Ontario's Premier, Doug Ford, added a completely different kind of pressure into this mix over the same 48-hour stretch, one that doesn't fit neatly into the tariff for tariff framework at all. In an interview, Ford said a past Republican president known specifically for opposing tariffs would be furious watching what current trade policy is doing to America's closest ally. He said Trump had effectively declared economic war against his closest friend and ally. And he went further than any Canadian official had gone up to that point, saying Canada should be ready to cut off electricity and critical minerals to the United States if the fight continues to escalate. He specifically named the high-grade nickel Ontario ship south and signaled a willingness to extend that same approach to oil and potash if things kept getting worse. He said people underestimate Canada, that everyone up there is all in, at a fever pitch, ready for an economic war if it comes to that. Trump responded by dismissing Ford in personal terms. Ford responded by calling Trump a bully. That exchange sits completely outside the dollar-for-dollar tariff strategy entirely. It's a separate, higher-stakes form of leverage, and it shows that not every part of the Canadian response has been as contained and careful as the federal tariff matching approach has been. It's worth pausing on Ford's intervention specifically because it exposes something the dollar-for-dollar tariff strategy simply doesn't solve on its own. Matching tariffs precisely is a strong tool when the fight is about the price of goods crossing a border. It keeps the retaliation proportional and prevents unrelated industries from getting caught in unnecessary crossfire. But it does very little if the fight escalates into a question of supply rather than price. High-grade nickel isn't something you can simply tax your way around if you're the one buying it. If the shipments stop entirely, there often isn't an alternate supplier who can fill that specific gap on short notice, especially not at the scale American manufacturing needs. Electricity presents the exact same problem in a slightly different form. Certain American border communities and industries depend directly on power that flows across that line every single day. And no tariff schedule in the world changes the simple fact that if the power doesn't cross, the lights don't stay on. Ford's threat sits entirely outside the federal government's precision matching approach. And that's part of why it landed with such a different kind of weight than another round of retaliatory tariffs would have. It signaled that if Washington keeps pushing past the tariff fight into something that feels existential to Ontario specifically, the province has forms of leverage the federal dollar-for-dollar strategy was never designed to use in the first place. Carney himself has not minced words about how his government sees the overall situation, even while keeping the retaliatory tariffs narrowly targeted and carefully controlled. Asked directly whether Canada considers itself in a trade war, he said something simple and blunt. You're at war when you get attacked. We got attacked. That's the tone at the top right now. Controlled, precise retaliation on the trade, numbers themselves, paired with completely unambiguous public language about what Ottawa believes is actually happening behind closed doors. There's a broader context worth adding here too, because absolutely none of this is happening in a vacuum. And understanding just how deep this trade relationship actually runs helps explain why both sides keep describing the stakes in such dramatic, almost existential terms. The auto sector specifically has been built over roughly 3 decades, first under NAFTA and then under USMCA, around a supply chain that treats the U.S. Canada-Mexico border almost like an internal state line, rather than an international boundary between 3 separate countries. A single vehicle can cross that border multiple times before it's finished. Raw steel becomes stamped parts in one country, gets shipped for engine or transmission assembly in another, crosses back for final vehicle assembly, and then crosses again as a finished product heading to dealerships across the continent. That system exists because it's efficient. Each side specializes in different stages of production, and the entire arrangement only works if the tariffs on all those individual crossings stay low or fully exempted the way the current agreement intends. A 50% tariff dropped into the middle of that system doesn't function like a simple tax on a finished import sitting at a port. It compounds every single time a partially finished product crosses the border again during production, which is exactly part of why industry voices describe the threat in terms of entire assembly lines halting completely, rather than simply prices rising a little for consumers. It's also why the ambiguity Trump left hanging in his Monday post over whether USMCA-compliant vehicles keep their exemption matters so much in practical terms. If that exemption survives intact, the disruption is serious but survivable for compliant manufacturers who've built their operations around following the agreement's rules. If it doesn't survive, a huge share of the vehicles currently moving through that integrated system suddenly faces a tariff that essentially wasn't designed with this specific, deeply interconnected supply chain in mind at all. That ambiguity is also exactly the kind of detail that tends to get resolved not in one single announcement, but through weeks or even months of clarification, lobbying, and pressure from the industries caught directly in the middle of it, which is part of why the skepticism from auto executives carries real weight here. A tariff this disruptive to American manufacturers, not just Canadian ones, tends to generate its own domestic pressure inside the United States, the closer it actually gets to taking effect. And that internal pressure has, in past rounds of this exact dispute, been part of what's pushed threatened numbers toward negotiated outcomes rather than the original headline figure everyone panicked about at first. None of that guarantees January 1st plays out any particular way. Nobody watching this closely is claiming certainty about the outcome. But it does explain why so much of the serious reporting around this story treats the 50% number as a ceiling being used for leverage, rather than a fixed final outcome that's already locked in place. So here's where this stands as we head toward the two dates that actually matter most. September 8th, when Canada's dollar-for-dollar retaliatory tariffs take effect, specifically matched to the American measures rather than expanded past them in any direction. And January 1st, 2027, when Trump's 50% threat on autos, parts, and steel is currently scheduled to take effect, still without clarity on whether USMCA-compliant vehicles keep their exemption, and still facing real skepticism from people inside the industry about whether it actually survives. Contact with the real deadline once it finally arrives. In between those two dates sits Canada's actual strategy, laid bare for anyone paying close attention. Not a bigger threat than Washington's. A precisely matched one, paired with direct financial support for the workers and businesses caught in the middle of a fight they didn't start. The exact same formula Carney's government used back in March, now scaled up significantly for a fight that's grown considerably more serious in just a matter of months. So think back to the question sitting underneath this entire story from the very beginning. When a country gets hit with an economic threat from a partner many times its own size, is the smarter move to escalate and match the aggression head on, matching size with size, threat with threat? Or is it to respond with precision, hitting exactly where the other side escalated and nowhere else, while putting the money straight into the hands of the people actually absorbing the damage on the ground? Canada has now run that exact playbook twice, once in March and again this week. And so far, it has kept this conflict from spiraling into something that damages the entire trade relationship, rather than just the specific pieces Washington chose to target in the first place. Whether that holds once January actually arrives is a question nobody on either side of this dispute can answer with real certainty yet. Here's the thing worth carrying with you after this video ends. Trump's public language this week has been built around one single idea, that Canada needs the American market more than the other way around, and that the size gap between the two economies is itself the leverage in this fight. Carney's actual policy record, both in March and again this week, has been built around a completely different idea entirely. That leverage isn't only about size, it's about precision, about knowing exactly which categories to match, which ones to protect at all costs, and where to send the money once it's actually collected from the other side. Those two theories of leverage are about to be tested against each other in real time, on a fixed calendar, with an entire continent's auto industry sitting directly in the middle of the result. Watch the two dates closely. Watch whether the USMCA exemption question ever gets a straight, clear answer out of Washington. And watch whether Doug Ford's electricity and mineral threat stays a rhetorical warning meant to sound tough in an interview, or turns into something Ontario actually puts into motion for real. However this resolves, it is very unlikely to look like either side's opening position from this week. And that gap between what got threatened this week and what actually happens by January is exactly where this story is headed next. If you want to see it unfold in real time as it happens, subscribe now, keep your notifications turned on, and I'll see you in the next one.